Hi, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Chris Andrew podcast. These are dynamic days following the assassination of Charlie Kirk. I honestly thought that I was a bit slow to respond to it with my episode last week. I almost didn't put it out because I thought that events would have overtaken it. But it seems that there's a lot more fuel until it runs its course. Or stuff that I talked about in terms of how people are responding to it and responding to each other, responding to it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The kind of typical clamoring for moral high ground that you see, but then also the wielding of whatever axe it is that you have to grind across whatever the contemporary issue is. That's all still on full display. Thank you for those of you who did listen to it. I've received some nice messages from it, but curiously, the only public comment I got was from someone saying, "Don't care about this at all, shit take," which, that's just exactly the point that I thought I was belaboring. We're coming quickly off the back of that episode. I thought that it would be nice to visit some of the concepts that came up in it. So I'm not going to be talking about Charlie Kirk in any way today. Instead, I'm going to do a little bit more unpacking of the concept of elite overproduction, because it's one that came up. If you didn't listen to the episode, I'll give you a quick update. Peter Turchin uses this concept of elite overproduction as a measurement for his modeling in trying to predetermine when the conditions are ripe for social disruption. The society produces too many people who consider themselves to be of the elite without having the capacity to absorb them into roles and stations that befit the status, leading to disgruntlement and those people turning their talents against the incumbent systems of power and authority within society. So it's obviously very difficult to predict the future, but the reason we're looking at this is because he used this theory in the 2010s to predict that there would be a resurgence of popularist politics within the US by the end of that decade, and then there would be crises starting at the start of the 2020s and then continuing as this disgruntlement increases. And given that's something we're seeing, and it was something that I talked about in response to the increase of political violence in the US, I thought it'd be fun to look at, because the concept doesn't just apply to the US, it applies to much of the world. And there are some interesting ideas there. And I think it's a nice handle to be able to do sort of around the grounds of society and look at a lot of the things that I've already looked at in existing episodes of the podcast, particularly thinking about the coming zillionaires, where there'll be huge changes to how we structure our jobs and lives. Also, the episode on culture lag, which looked at how a lot of our existing scripts for how we should operate culturally are quickly becoming obsolete or have long been obsolete, but we still act as though that's not the case. These are super interesting episodes, I think, if you want to go back and listen to them, they're still salient. But today, I'm going to look through a lot of those points and move towards, I guess, an idea of what you and I do with our own lives in responding to this phenomenon and understanding these trends as we try to navigate for ourselves and for the people that we love and for the society that we live in, good, meaningful, enjoyable lives. Before we get stuck in though, as always, I want to say thank you so much to my Patreon patrons. If you'd like to support the show, please jump on over to patreon.com/Endry, Endrey. I would love to have you there. There's a free tier and you get to vote in upcoming episodes. But for now, status anxiety. So I want to start off today with a clarification about what this status anxiety is and what this elite overproduction can feel like. And for me, in short, it kind of feels like if you have a society where enough people are disenfranchised by the pillars of that society itself, we're all monkeys. And if we're sitting at our little monkey table playing a game that feels unfair, we will flip the board and start again. And there's plenty of data points to prove this, but you can manipulate data to prove kind of anything. So I'm not going to get too into the weeds of graphs and stats today, but I will start by saying that I think there's a general feeling that the work that we're doing as a collective is less fulfilling to people's core needs. The work that we're doing, the societies that we live in, the communities that we live in, it doesn't feel as fulfilling as it could be. And worse, the conditions in which we have accepted many of those trade-offs were ones in which we were getting continuously wealthy and wealthier than previous generations. But that increasingly is not the case for most people as well. Certainly in aggregate, the generation that I'm a part of is the first one for a while that is going to continue to be poorer than our parents. And in combination, that sort of feels like a bad deal, and people respond to that in various ways. But it's that type of phenomena that leads to the extremist elements of dissatisfaction as expressed by things like assassinations and assassination attempts and other forms of violence. re-emerging in higher quantities. And it's not surprising that we would get here because it seems to me that we employ many rationalist tools to kind of reason our economies to be leveraged, to be optimal for people's lives. But the inputs that we use to do that are not exhaustive. And so while we give increasing authority to bean counters in policymaking realms, that authority is taken without many of the things that are fundamentally important to people. This is not a new idea, but it's one that is kind of the central thesis of the book that I'm idly working on that I keep referencing in this podcast on certainty. In this instance, where economists look at society as successful or not in its economy, we measure things like GDP, rate of employment/unemployment, and wages. And those are no doubt extremely important. I would be upset if we stopped counting those things. But what's behind those numbers, which is perhaps more important to you or me, is what is that? What is the job that you're doing? What are the skills involved to do it? What's the meaning to you behind it? Those things are inevitably going to be far more impactful on what your day today feels like and what your life feels like, and then how you turn up into your own society and interactions with others, which of course will then frame almost everything about how you're feeling. If you could pull the lever and make the switch, would you work in a job that made half as much money but was twice as meaningful to you? I mean, it's an easy hypothetical question, but it's also one that's pretty easy to map. The collective society was roughly half as wealthy as it is today in the 70s, and people seem to live their lives quite happily in that period. You know, I don't hear people talk about the 1970s generally as a time of deprivation or extreme. People were still doing things, exactly the same things as they're doing now in many instances, for half as much money, just because of the nature of wealth and productivity and how things grow over time. And I think that that's something that we really don't have the sense of very much, how extreme that curve has been in the growth of wealth over the last century or so. Because I think if we did have that sense of perspective, there would be a lot more decisions that we would make trading off 1 or 2 percentage gains of GDP here or there for the extraordinary gains for our day-to-day lives that they could offer. I mean, even in that example, if we all worked 2.5 days a week instead of 5, we would be able to live even wealthier because of productivity gains than people lived in the 70s. I'm not suggesting we do literally that, but you can imagine that there should be a conversation with what we do with our extraordinary productivity gains rather than continuously seek more and more, because there are other considerations of value. And you see this a little bit in the movements in some countries for 4-day work weeks and things like that. But it turns out that people in many instances actually prefer working 5 days because they end up being roughly about as productive, but have more time to hang out and have a lunch and talk to their colleagues and things like that. Because of course, it's those small details of your life that make it worth living rather than just being an optimal productive unit. And yet again, things like how much time do you have to hang out? How good is the lunch that you have, et cetera, et cetera? How aligned are the values of the work that you're doing with your personal values? Those things are not measured in our great assessment of how we set the policy settings for our societies. The CEO of Ford in the 70s was happy to work for $800,000. Today, the CEO of Ford makes $25 million. That's a significant difference, even adjusting for inflation. But of course, the guy doing that job in the 70s was perfectly happy doing it, which touches onto something which I think is the salient factor in the dissatisfaction that people seem to be increasingly feeling with regards to elite overproduction, which is relative status. It's much easier to make $800,000 in a world where your fellow CEOs are making $600,000, $700,000 than it is to make that money in a world in which your fellow CEOs are making 20, 30 million. There's a really interesting study from social psychology, which are the types of things I'm normally a bit hesitant to cite, but this one's been repeated and consistently gets similar results. And it's a simple question, and you can ask it of yourself right now. Would you rather make $100,000 and live on a street where everybody made $200,000? Or would you rather make $50,000 and live on a street where everybody made $25,000? And there are a lot of smarty pants ways to think about it. Don't worry about what the relative size of the economy or the market, what the purchasing power of that would be. Just assume it's just as simple as given right now, today's money, those are your conditions. Which would you choose? Yeah, maybe it's an easy and obvious answer for you. If you haven't taken the time to answer, hit pause and come up with your response. Oh, there you go. I gave you a pause for free. The interesting thing about this is that people skew roughly 50-50 in how they respond to that. Half of people seem to be happy to make less money in a realm where they get to be the dominant big dog, and the other half would rather the absolute increase of doubling the amount of money and they don't care how much other people have, which is an interesting division because it effectively reveals that half of us would happily take half as much money if it meant that everybody else we knew had if it meant that we were richer than everybody else that we know. And that relative gap is something that's really important to us. We're status-seeking animals. We've evolved to be within a group of a couple hundred, and so much of our brain mapping is in analyzing and determining where our relative status is. And it's not so much about everybody wants to be the big dog. It's just we want to be somewhere that we consider as reasonable for our capacities. And we have that righteous indignation if we feel like we've earned something and we don't get it. And the more of that that's out there, the messier things are going to be for the tribe, especially as we have these mega hives now. And not to mention all the tools that we have to subvert our regular cognition. We can think our status is about here, but then, it's the famous example, but you can open that portal in your pocket at any second and have access to the top 0.0001% of every single sphere of human endeavor and assess your relative value against something that you would never even have encountered just a couple of generations ago. Now you can have that on tap all the time for your brain. And there are obvious consequences of that. So that increased rate of growth across the generations until now has been accompanied by increased opportunities. So that's led to a culture of expectation where it's been a while since people have expected things to get worse. And yet now we're in that world where we have those expectations and all the cultures leading to it and how we make our lifestyle decisions and prepare for the future, but in a world where that can't be met. There's an economist I follow on a Substack called Noah Smith. Very interesting writer. I would recommend you follow him. It's No Opinion, Noah Pinion.blog. And he's summed this up well. So I'm just going to holus bolus share this paragraph on the unmet expectations factor. Because there's a lot of, unsurprisingly, there's a lot of cultural baggage around sort of the entitlement of the youths and people. My day used to have to work for things, and everybody's so expectant now, but they're not willing to do things. Okay. Put that to the side. That may be true in specific instances, but generally as a trend, put it to the side because there are bigger structural things going on here. Okay, Noah Smith. Try to think of things from the perspective of a 25-year-old who just graduated from UC Davis in 2010 with an English degree. For the past 4 years, you've lived the life of an intellectual. You've read dozens of books, expanded your mind with 100 deep ideas about society and history and the purpose of life, spent long nights discussing and debating those ideas with people just as smart as you are. And all that time, whether you're the first in your family to go to school or the scion of an upper middle class family looking to make your parents proud, you've been told that college is the ticket to a spot in the top 20% of American society. And you and your parents have certainly paid a price tag that reflects that expectation. And on top of that, everyone has told you that you can and should find a career doing something you love, something that helps the world, and something that uses the education you paid so much to get. Then you graduate, and nobody wants lawyers. Magazines are dying. Newsrooms are dying. Universities aren't hiring. And your best bet is either to roll the dice again with years of grad school or to claw your way into some corporate drone job where you'll be filing TPS reports all day while your diploma rots in a box in your parents' attic. Meanwhile, you're stuck with $40,000 in undergraduate debt and the payments are now coming due. It's neither entitled nor bratty nor arrogant to be unhappy with that outcome. So I think this is a strong candidate for explaining why unrest exploded among the American elites in the late 2010s. Now, that covers just one vocation, humanities, in one society, the US, across one generation, millennials. If you had to guess, would you think that things for young people now are better or worse across the whole gamut of society? I think it's fair to say significantly worse, not in that the conditions are certainly going to be worse for people in the future, but more that it's unpredictable how your inputs will go. And I think summing this up perfectly is there recently been as many people graduating computer sciences as almost all humanities put together. And at the same time, there's been a collapse in the number of jobs for people with computer sciences with the advent of AI technologies and the general collapse of the tech bubble that happened in the early 2020s. So what are all these people going to do? And also graduating with $40,000 debt, that's peanuts compared to what people are graduating with now. As I said, I talked about it a little bit in the cultural lag episode, but I'll look at it again. Why do we have this issue of elite overproduction here? It seems that university and the culture surrounding that are a large part of the story. Certainly a few generations ago, university was something for a minority of people. Now more people go to university than not. And at the same time, university as a product has really gone downhill, particularly in recent years, as the cost pressures have led them to gouge out the quality of the product that they offer while simultaneously increasing the price. It's really become a poor proposition, but it is that cultural, social ticket, and we still have the culture of pursuing it and encouraging it. I think that's generating more and more of this disappointment. It's one thing to go into an Amazon warehouse at age 17 and be like, well, this is a job and I'm going to make money doing this and structure my life around that. It's another thing to do that at age 25 when you've just finished your master's in computing or fine arts and your expectation for what your future is going to be is kind of radically subverted. I think another important factor driving this phenomenon is the kind of absence of a strong social order. And I'm not an advocate of what the strong social orders have been in the past, but as the uniform meeting places of religion, nationality, class, whatever it might be, as those things have sort of been exploded and diluted quite heavily, in the absence of a clear replacement, it's broadly just market forces that have gone in to fill that vacuum. And those are market forces that are indifferent to the unitary well-being of the individual beyond the individual's capacity to meet those market requirements. This is why you see so much dissatisfaction with things that are in public, because they kind of revert to minimalizing the cost of achieving X outcome and minimalizing the outcome itself. So that's why, we're sort of dissatisfied with our political class, because they seem to be not visionaries, but people who do the least bad job of just managing stuff. And we're dissatisfied with the products that we get because they're designed to be as cheap as possible and plausibly be sellable rather than as rewarding as possible in your life. And then it's not surprising that we make those choices in that environment for ourselves as well, because it's easier for me to choose to make 1,000 sprockets for Jeff Bezos and to keep 30 of them for myself than to choose to make one sprocket for myself running a cake stand or something like that. So the downward pressure on so many things that are important for our lives becomes something that very quickly shapes our entire society. And not actively measuring and valuing things like beauty, well-being, meaning, values, whatever, like all of these things that are a bit more esoteric and inevitably impossible to come to a full consensus on, they've kind of been left behind entirely, which inevitably generates disgruntlement. Another interesting part of this that I want to talk about is skills, because there's a big difference between the skills that we accrue to generate GDP and be competitive in contemporary job markets and skills that we accrue that have meaning for ourselves and bring benefits to our lives and benefits to each other and benefits to society. Just as an anecdote, my old neighbour at Fawns Crescent in Canberra, Jed, he is, or at least was, a full-blown communist, and he worked at, I think, Baker's Delight, and would always leave bread at my door. I loved it. He also worked on cars, and I needed to change my oil, and I was 30-something at the time, and I'd never changed oil in a car. I'd never done it. I didn't grow up in an environment of people doing handy stuff, and I'm not particularly handy myself, so I hadn't pursued it. And I asked him for some help. I said, hey, man, I got to change my oil. Can you recommend a mechanic, or can I pay you to do it? And he said, come on, Chris, we'll go to the Repco, pick up some oil and we'll do it ourselves. And it's cosplaying for me being in the realm of someone who's useful. So I was delighted. And yeah, we drove, bought the oil, like all this stuff had just seemed like as abstract to me as I'm sure reading music is to most people. Like it just existed in the cognitive realm and seemed like a thing that only magical people could do. All we were doing was driving somewhere, buying some oil, drove home, put a tray under the car, went under it, opened it up, drained the oil, poured in some new oil. And I said to him, man, this is so fun, because it really is. Like, it's not like, none of it is a hard job. It's just a few small fun steps. And he said, yeah, this is what capitalism is robbing you of. And I thought about it, like, I'm not a communist and I don't really enjoy its language very much. So it took me a moment to think about it, but he's totally right. There's something there. There was something that I would have only paid someone else to do. And in doing so, robbed myself of the enjoyment of doing it and also the capacity, the chance to develop the skills to do it. And I wonder how much of that intrinsic satisfaction there is in any number of life skill things that we are able to avoid just by exchanging capital for certain things rather than doing them for ourselves, because we don't take the opportunity to develop those skills. I mean, I'm not a sweet tooth, but I'll stick with my cake theme. Imagine the difference in quality in having your friends over and baking an apple pie that you present to them and get to enjoy yourself versus the experience of replying to some emails and updating some spreadsheets and then generating the money to go out and buy an apple pie. Is it the same experience? Of course not. There's like the experience of being able to make something already, even if you made exactly the same quality pie, is far superior. But of course, inevitably, also something you make is going to be 10 times tastier than something that you just buy. In fact, a side note, you can get a frozen pie. I think it's from Woolworths. I took a picture of it once because I was just checking the ingredients. It contains beef. Frozen apple pie from Woolworths contains beef. What the fuck? Anyway, I'm maybe getting lost in the details, but You can see how the trade-off that we make in prioritizing certain skills over others in order to be able to make more money in the workplace is something that massively materially changes your life. And when those skills are affording you less and less in society relative to your parents, of course that's generating discontent. Think about how upset everyone who's locked outside of the housing market feels in Australia. It feels inevitable that there'll be some political consequences of that where there'll be a tipping point. And even if it's not related to housing, you can see it being expressed elsewhere. And for some small percentage of outlier people, that poor misattribution may express itself in the extremes as public violence. But even worse than the specific instances of violence, it's the very large swathes of disengagement and just the sort of lost opportunity cost of what people could be doing in terms of enjoying their lives. And what's more is there's very real evidence that this loss of skills is not restricted to arenas of quaint novelty, like, changing your own oil or baking a pie for your friends. It seems like people are losing the skills of being able to talk to each other, form meaningful relationships, have sex, even people who are in relationships, and whatever other litany of things that are going to be not only nice to have in your life, but the most important things that you will do with your time and the most important way that you can contribute to enjoying yourself and improving society. Those things, once again, are just absolutely not considered at all when the Treasurer says, oh, look, unemployment's down to 4.7%. It was 4.8%. Like that stuff is, I mean, who gives a shit? If the amount of people that are having zero sex in a cohort goes from 10% to 35%, surely that's like far more important, like far more important than how many people are able to work for Vodafone marketing in a particular month or whatever. But we give huge priority to one issue and basically zero to another. And it generates a pressure that bleeds out the sides. Ultimately, I don't really think that this is a bad thing that's occurring. I, in one sense, the shift in this social dynamic can be read as something that's quite liberating, because if the terms of a game that are put in front of you are so poor that they'll generate distress, well, good news. Like, we live in a time of incredible wealth and lots of opportunities for new things that have never existed before to be created or engaged with. And so that kind of gives you the opportunity to find your own meaning, which, to speak personally for a minute, I've struggled to make money, but I still find that difficulty to be on balance a more rewarding thing, because I get to do things that are important to me, like spend time with my kids or do this podcast or write music, cook a lot, whatever it might be, the things that happen to be important to me. You get the opportunity to find and create your own meaning rather than perhaps furiously re-guide yourself to be something that you're not in order to sell those skills to a market that's giving you worse terms than it did your parents. But I do think that place can only be reached by having a conversation about these things in their real terms and acknowledging that the old rules of the game and the ones that many people are playing and will tell you to play, and society's put out a lot of paths to structure encouraging you into, are no longer salient or going to offer the prizes that are promised. And then also processing that disappointment, because if you think that you're going to get something and you don't, that's frustrating. It's hard. And if you think that the world is, going to be fair, well, it's not a fair world. And if you focus on the things that are afforded to people who aren't you higher up in that monkey ladder, it's going to be immiserating. I don't want to slip too much into guru land, but I think that there's a really nice opportunity now for people to find their own values, but you do have to consciously wrangle with what those values are. And I think you do that by just doing things in life and finding what resonates and what does not resonate, and just noticing when you find yourself being bitter about something, take the signal of that, and take notice of when you feel really alive as well, and pursue that. If you are out there struggling with this in any way, you have my total sympathies. It's a difficult problem, and I think one of the big ones of our time. Ultimately, the good news is that there's a lot to navigate that is navigable, and it's ultimately a responsibility that you have to yourself, but also to the people that you love, to help them through solving those problems, and all of us to build a society where we don't fall prey to the temptations of extreme dissatisfaction and the inevitable misattributions that come with falling more into those hindbrain monkey emotions. But what do you think? Tell me, please get in touch. If you're on the Instagram at Chris Andrew Podcast, maybe you're watching on YouTube, listening on Spotify, wherever it is, leave a comment. And while you're at it, I would love it if you could give me a thumbs up, 5 stars, review, send to your friends, whatever it is, because there's a lot more stuff to explore and I love to give time to it. And that stuff really gives me the signal boost to prioritize doing this in the way that I would like to. Last of all, if you're living in Budapest like me or you're nearby, I'm appearing at the Brain Bar Festival this week, where I'm interviewing a number of people, including Dr. Ian McGilchrist. And I'm super excited about that. He's one of my favorite public intellectuals. And to have him on the podcast has long been a dream of mine. And so to get to have a chance to talk to him in person is really thrilling. So come along. It's free if you're a student or a teacher, but I don't think it's very expensive in any case. Brain Bar Festival on the 18th and 19th of September. To everyone else, thanks so much for listening, especially patrons. I really appreciate your support. All right. See you next time. Bye.